time once again for Community Forum, and we're very lucky to have back with us live in the studios this morning Ari Kohn. Ari Kohn is founder and president of the PostPrison Education Program. So start out, tell us about the PostPrison Education Program and how you came to founding it.
It's a nonprofit that helps people coming out of Washington's prisons, well, all prisons, attend post-secondary education, whether a university, community college, or VOTEC. I founded it in 2005 when as a result of meeting somebody who was coming out of prison as his brother went back in, and that somebody who's become a close friend of mine over the years, Kevin, was suffering serious mental illness and had been dealing with addiction much of his life and poverty. And I was just really inspired by meeting him, and it sort of sent shockwaves through my life to the point that I contacted some people at UW and asked if they would support a program that helped get people like Kevin into college, and they all enthusiastically responded, and a bunch of really naive people started the program. I think August 23rd, 2005.
And that was fairly close after you had gone through the University of Washington, after you had gotten out of federal prison. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. And that's why education was really on my mind. I came out of federal prison June 28, 2000, and went straight to UW. I actually moved from Western North Carolina to Seattle just for one reason, and that was the University of Washington. And I'd spent 4 years at UW, and it was in the fourth year when I met Kevin. And it was a UW professor that actually directed me to a nonprofit event where I met him.
Was it evident at that time how important education was to your landing back on your feet?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's 16, 17 years later, to me, the University of Washington gave me my life back, really. It's hallowed ground for me, really. And so I thought, when I met Kevin, I thought if anything could help somebody who's suffering comorbidity get on their feet and build a future, it would be getting involved with higher education. So it was my experience at UW. I mean, that experience put me at the Senate, and just exposed me to many of Washington State government leaders that I had known over the years and worked with, and that have made our work possible with the post-prison education program.
So your story is a great illustration of one's willpower to be able to change themselves prior to the creation of your organization and its amazing success rate, which we'll talk about in a minute. You did basically pull it together all on your own at that point.
Well, I mean, I was fortunate. I came from a family that, I mean, I didn't have any money problems when I came out. That's just a calm way to put it, and that's very unlike everybody. I don't know anybody coming out of Washington State prisons. I've not yet met one person that's coming out from money, that has support and doesn't have huge financial problems and other problems, mental illness, addiction, and on and on and on.
So talk about that. Talk about how your program helps people What's the situation for people coming out of prison today?
Well, you know, I've become obsessed. It might be an accurate word with serious mental illness and the fact that the public is just seems, thanks to mainstream media, the public has no clue. We Washingtonians have no clue who we have locked up in our prisons. We really have no clue, and that's thanks to Seattle Times, Blethen, as I call them, and other like media. So there, we. There's a story that I tell a lot, but it's really center to our life now. It's in 2010, a lady who was a counselor at one of the prisons at Monroe called me and wanted me to commit to help a guy who was coming out of the special offender unit up there, which is the prison that houses people who are seriously mentally ill. And her attitude was like, if you don't get involved, this guy can't succeed. And she told me that his diagnosis was schizoaffective disorder. And I had never heard that term before in my life. And I went to the Mayo Clinic website, searched that term, printed out 9 pages, read about it, and was horrified. And so I thought, at the time, Cheryl Strange was deputy secretary of the DOC. She's now CEO at Western States, and amazing lady. And I thought, I asked Cheryl, I got frustrated because we kept seeing more and more people suffering mental illness. And from that point forward, and finally I got frustrated, and I can't tell you what I said to her in an email because we're on air, but I mean, I was just like, I sent her an email. I'm like, Cheryl, how many are there of the 700 people who come out of prison every month? How many are suffering serious mental illness? And she guessed it was 100. And then a couple months later, I was up at another one of the Monroe prisons, the Washington State Reformatory, keynoting a graduation. And Scott Frakes, who's now head of the Department of Corrections in Nebraska, was superintendent there. And so he was over SOU, and I told him what Cheryl said, and I said, is that accurate? And he was like, no, it's got to be 140 or more. So that's 16, 17%. Well, at the beginning of this year, we got data, S-code data from the Department of Corrections, and so if you have an S code of 2, 3, 4, or 5, that's indicative of serious mental illness. If it's 1, you're healthy, or presumably if your S code is 0, you're unclassified. So people with S codes of 2, 3, 4, 5, 34% of Washington's prisoners, more than 1/3. And you have to assume that if you classified all of the unclassified, some of them would be 2, 3, 4, or 5, and that might take the 34% to 40%, or who knows where. But that was staggering for me. And then we had from David Daniels, who left DOC, an amazing man, left DOC, went to DSHS, and now he's at WATEC. We had data that 78% of the prisoners have drugs and addiction in their life. And then, so where comorbidity comes in is where serious mental illness and drugs and addiction intersect, right? And some unlucky person, or many unlucky people, are dealing with both of those. And so that's the key. People are coming out of prison not only with no money, no clothes, no job, generally no education, but they're coming out dealing with serious mental illness and with drugs and addiction in their lives. I mean, you heard, I think, me talking about in prison the other day. I think Jenny Lord and I have been to at least 10 funerals and memorial services in the last couple of years, and that's all centered around relapses, drugs, addiction, and death. And so it's a sad mess, which the state could do something about. The state could fix it. We, a little podunk nonprofit, us, we've learned how to overcome all that. And so the state with their bazillion-dollar budgets and the DOC with their $1.8 billion budget, they certainly can do it. It's by choice that they don't. It's by choice that they don't. And that's, to me, criminal.
So the state currently has a recidivism rate of around 53%, is that
No,
correct?
that's readmission.
Oh,
So,
okay.
So recidivism is measured up with a 3-year time period from when you release. That's 32.2. And that's increased significantly in the last year. It stayed fairly level for many years at 27, 28%, and then in the last couple of years it's jumped to 32.2. What's jumped insanely high is the readmission rate. So that's not time barred. So that's you return to prison with one or more new felony convictions, but within your lifetime, not within a 3-year period. And that went from like 42% in 2011 to, as of 2 years ago, it crossed the 50% mark, which is it's really, I mean, I feel like people should be taken out of the legislature and locked up in prison, and the governor with them, for allowing this to happen, because it just doesn't need to happen. And when you've got more than half of the people that come out of prison returning to prison with new felony convictions, that's insane. It's unjustifiable. It's reprehensible. Blah blah blah. And a couple times it's gone as high as 53%, and that's just wacko. I don't know. I don't even know what the words are to describe it. There's a I think interesting story in 2009. Eldon Vale called me. It was really interesting. He was secretary of the DOC. It was 7:30 in the morning. I'm at home raising bran and bananas, and I'm not expecting the secretary of the DOC to call. And Eldon called, and he was like, "Look, Ari, data is significant. The legislative session's coming up. You have got to have data. You have to have researchers study your effectiveness." And we ended up paying $21,000 to some fancy pants researchers that are well educated, well housed, when I'd rather spend the money on former prisoners who are homeless and hungry and uneducated. But we spent that money because we really needed to. And the state found out that we had nobody recidivate. Well, we only, at the time we were only 4 years old. We had 282 subjects. And so it wasn't a meaningful work record in terms of longevity, and it wasn't a large number of subjects. But the question really quickly, so they called it a promising practice. So the question really quickly became, why does somebody? I spent the day yesterday with a guy named Keith Whiteman who works with me. Keith, at the time in 2009, had done 10 or 11 years in prison, had 15 felony convictions. And the question really quickly became, why does somebody like him recidivate, and then when they get involved with the post-prison education program, the insanity stops. And so another researcher was hired, an anthropologist, and she studied that, and the answer was, we're effective because we meet the legitimate frugal needs of former prisoners, importantly, at the time they arise. And that's all. Like Inslee just did this really stupid study. I thought it was ignorant, and I was hugely, when he stopped the death penalty, I thought he was a hero, but he's not always a hero. And when he ran this little group to look at how to reduce recidivism, I sort of felt like we already figured that out, and it's easily done. You don't need to get a bunch of people in your office and publicize you're doing it and pretend like you really give a darn. I almost slipped up there. And, uh, and it's just meet the legitimate frugal needs at the time they arise, and people will not recidivate. I mean, in 13 years, we've interestingly, or we're 11 years old, we've had 13 people recidivate, and that was just documented by the University of Washington, and we're 92.13% successful. Our recidivism rate is less than 8%. 74.23% of the people that we work with are high needs, high risk, technically HV, HNV, that's the DOC terminology, and a large percentage of them have S codes of 2, 3, 4, 5. So we're working with the people who have the most difficult lives to live, and they're being successful, and you've met a lot of them. And so we've proven how to do it, and we've made it clear to the legislature what needs to be done, to the DOC what needs to be done, to the governor what needs to be done, and it's not happening. And that's by choice. They've made that choice for whatever reasons. They've made that choice, and for my money, you can take them down to Walla Walla and put them on old death row. Don't flip the switch; just lock them up.
I believe you've termed that before legislative cowardice.
Yes, yes, it is legislative cowardice. It's like Richard Nixon is alive and well, even though people think he's deceased. He's not, and he lives in the form of this insane language: be tough on crime, don't be soft on crime, that he started back in the early 70s, and it's just still there. These people in Olympia, not all of them, but really most of them, they protect their little $40,000 a year job as though they were getting paid $500 million a day, as though like the world would come to an end if they got voted out of office. So they won't do anything that might jeopardize them being reelected. And one of the things that can jeopardize you being reelected is being perceived as being soft on crime. And people, Adam Klein a long time ago was on a TV show about us, and he talked about his peers. At the time, he was chair of the Judiciary Committee, and he very smartly said that his peers at the legislature needed to learn to be smart on crime as opposed to being pulled down by this battle about soft on crime, tough on crime. But they never have, and I don't think within my lifetime they ever will. But they're so afraid of being attacked for being soft on crime if they vote to fund post-secondary education for prisoners and former prisoners, and that's the whole issue.
But your program, and you've just come out with this new study that shows you have 8% or less for a recidivism rate if you just educate people. It's a well-known fact that education costs, it's less for education for a year than to have someone in prison for a year. So just economically, it clearly, I mean, even ignoring the human factors, economically, it appears to make more sense to just educate these people when they get out. And voila, the 92% are back in society and helping.
Yeah, there's a lady who's third year law, a former prisoner who's graduating Seattle U School of Law this year, like right now, she's doing her externship now, and we've got a guy, Chris Jones, who is an electrical engineer in New Hampshire, married to a veterinary, Dolphy Jordan did 21 years, and DOC went down when he was 16. He works for the King County Superior Court right now. His employer is a company that's contracted to the drug court, but he works at the drug court, and he's valuable. And Jenny Lord works for Catholic Community Services. Gina McConnell-Otten works for me at our Southwest Washington offices in DOC work release facilities every Monday. Shelley Clear, who I think is one of my favorite stories, is a welder, and has 5 kids, has a home, is clean and sober, makes big money through the union. And it's just, these are all people. We were in prison the other day, and the former prisoners I had with me, I was just thinking, my God, there's a lot of felony convictions represented here. And I went down and asked everybody, okay, let me just confirm how many felonies and how many years. And we had more than 50 years with 5 former prisoners that were former students of ours. They had done more than 50 years in DOC and had more than 99 felony convictions. And they're all just amazingly successful. And there's no reason, but they wouldn't have been, but for us. And there's no reason that the Department of Corrections can't have that same success. They choose to spend their money in wrong ways. The legislature chooses to not fund correctly. The governor chooses to not make his secretary of the DOC do what needs to be done. It's outrageous.
So, and I know, like all nonprofits, your organization struggles for funds. We've got a legislative session that's just about to start here in a matter of weeks or days. And the state is currently, Department of Corrections spends, if I remember Ginny saying, $1.8 billion a year.
Yeah,
is that right?
Yeah.
And the state is...
Well, that's their biennial budget,
okay,
actually.
hungry for funds, and here appears to be a remedy towards both the number of people in prison as well as, again, economically, it seems to make sense.
Right.
So are you going to be going to the legislature this year, and what do you hope to get there?
You know, I'm not sure if we will or not. A guy who has been our lobbyist for several years met with the governor one-on-one and his chief of staff, David Postman, just a couple of weeks ago, presented the data from the University of Washington, and with the idea being that some funding for us would be in the governor's budget. It is not. And that same lobbyist, bet me years ago that he could get funding for us, and I'm like, I'll bet you can't, but I'll give you a chance. And like $1 bazillion later, we've never gotten funding from the legislature. And so I'm not sure it's a wise use of money to even fund a lobbyist this year to talk to legislators about doing what they won't do. So I'm literally, there's a form that I'm supposed to sign or not, and I haven't made up my mind whether I'm going to sign it. So it has to do with whether the lobbyist will continue to represent us this year. I don't know if I'm going to sign it or not. I haven't made up my mind. And I think the prudent use of our money would dictate that I not sign it. But I might let this be one last year with the legislature. So we'll see.
So you mentioned Seattle Times prior in terms of corporate media coverage of this issue, and we've got about 5 minutes left. Talk about the ignorance and misconception that are out there amongst the public from corporate media's portrayal of people who are incarcerated.
Well, first of all, the deal with mainstream media is they could educate the public, and I think they have. Certainly, they have a responsibility to sell advertising and make their payroll and pay the rent and make wealthy people wealthier and all of that. But I think they also have a moral responsibility to the public to tell the truth, and they're not telling the truth about our prisons and our prison population, and so you end up with ignorance and misconceptions. And I mean, I told one of the members of Inslee's little committee or whatever you call it that just finished up and reported to the legislature, and she was a student of ours, Tara Simmons, and I one night in a lengthy phone conversation, I'm like, I bet not one of you, not Satterberg, not you, certainly not Lydia Flora Barlow or these other people on Inslee's little pretend we're doing something committee, even know what an S code is or what the difference between the S code 2 and an S code 5 is, or know much about comorbidity or anything else that's really pertinent to recidivism and people not only recidivating but dying. And she told me that I was right, that the subject of serious mental illness had come up one time during all of this little pretend we're doing something meeting. So, but you know, the thing that the best example of ignorance, at least, came from a foundation that was our largest funder for years. Doris Buffett's foundation director, Mitty Beale, a couple of years ago, we had 34 applications that we had singled out that we really, really desperately wanted to help these people. They were what in our office we might call a white hot mess. I mean, and we knew that if we didn't get involved, they'd go down the tubes, and we knew we didn't have the money to help them, and we knew that we could be successful if we could fund it. And we actually made copies of these applications and sent them to Mitty in Philadelphia with a really heartfelt message asking for funding for those. And we just talked about it in really candid language. So to us, it was a life and death issue for these people, which it is. And Mitty came back to me and she said, you know, as a policy, the Sunshine Lady Foundation won't fund life and death situations. And honestly, from that email from her till this day, I'm sort of enraged, and I think, how could somebody who's been so deeply involved in funding better lives for prisoners and former prisoners not realize that it's always life and death? Every time we get involved with somebody, it's life and death. But you know, they're going to recidivate or often die, and very infrequently succeed. And I was just blown away that Doris's director had such a lack of understanding of the population that they'd been spending millions on, is to not realize that it's always life and death. And that might sound melodramatic, but it is. And then I'm like, even the good-hearted people are ignorant, and they just don't get it. And you know, it's you know, if we put something positive about, we're down to 1 minute, where if we put something positive on our Facebook page about prisoners, we get really hateful posts to the point that if we put something up, we have to watch it, right? And so I think if people understood who we have in our prisons, understood serious mental illness, understood drugs and addiction, understand how current prisoners generally get caught up in drugs and addiction by their parents at really early ages, 6, 8, 10, 12, then the attitude toward prisoners and prisons would be way different. But
What's the Post-Prison Education's website?
www.postprisonedu.org, or you can just Google Post-Prison Education Program, and the top link will be us.
All right. Well, with that, we are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us again today.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you.